Hello, welcome to the Bridge 360 Show podcast. I am your host, Stephanie Odia, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Merciful Ajinomo. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And we have a very special guest with us in the studio today. But before I get to introduce our special guest, I'd like to talk to us about what the Bridge 360 Show podcast is. Now, this show aims to provide useful information that will bridge the communication gap between the public and the government through its ministries and agencies. And so over to our guest today, we have a power expert in person of Mr. Yusuf Khalil. Welcome to today's episode, sir.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Yusuf Khalil. Now, let's talk about the role of TCN in the power sector. Would you mind explaining briefly what TCN is and what they do in the Nigerian power system?
Sure. But before we explain the role of the TCN, we need to understand the power system itself. We call it a system because there are several elements connected together. And these elements encompasses the generation, which produces the power, where you have different power plants to generate the electricity that the consumers utilizes. And then you have the transmission, where you have the wheeling of the power, which we would be concentrating a bit later. And then you have the distribution, where you have the distribution companies, where the supply is taken to when it is wheeled. Then it is now taken up to our doorsteps for the consumers to connect their various loads and consume the electricity supplied. So when we are concerned, this is why we call it a system, because of these integrated elements put up together to get this supply to where it is required. Now, when you get to the transmission company of Nigeria precisely, now once the power is generated or produced, it must be consumed because you can't store power. As it is produced, you have to consume it. Now, the transmission company of Nigeria will ensure that as the power is generated, they pick it up, they take it where it is required, and it is automatically consumed immediately. Now, this is one major role of the transmission company of Nigeria, and we call this wheeling the power or transporting the power, taking it from the location where it is produced to the various locations where it is required to be consumed. But that is not all, because by mere generating the power and taking it to where it is required to be consumed is not enough, because what you generate must be equivalent to what you consume.
All right.
This is the rule in power system, and we call it stability and balancing of the load. So to enable this happens, it's only the transmission company of Nigeria that could be able to do that, because they are acting as an interface between the generation as well as the distribution. So when the power is generated, the TCN will see this is the amount of power generated. Then the distribution companies will connect to that power for the consumption. It is the TCN that will see this is the amount of power that is the demand. We call it demand for the consumption. So they have to equate the two at every point in time. And that is called the balancing or stability. Where you have any disparity, the power generated is lower and the consumption is higher, there is tendency of the failure of the system. And where you have high generation and the consumption is less, there is tendency of the failure of the system as well. So the transmission company of Nigeria has the sole responsibility of ensuring that this stability is maintained at an equilibrium level, meaning that the input is always the same as the output. So they need to maintain the system at an efficiency of about 100%. But that is not all. This is the major function they do. But within this, they do what we call the dispatching of the power, the planning of the dispatch itself, the management of the load to be connected, the management of the dispatchable power to be connected onto the grid. When we say grid, we mean the entire infrastructure where you see the cables, the conductors, the towers, where the power will be flowing. That is a grid. Everything is a grid.
Just like we see on major expressways.
Exactly, yes. So that is the grid. So whatever is generated is put onto those lines. They will be flowing there. So whatever is there, they will have to manage that. What is the flow? What kind of flow is it? What is the input? What is coming as the output connected to consume the input? How do they balance that? And they have parameters to consider that, like the frequency, like the voltage. We don't have time for me to discuss this, but at least for them to understand that there must be that balancing and that stability. This balancing and stability ensures the security of the grid, ensures the integrity of the grid. It ensures the discrimination in the sense that they understand where the possibility of the consumption is coming and where there is failures. So they have to maintain that too, and then they have to maintain flexibility where there are problems and errors or disturbances. Are there possibilities of them diverting this to that, diverting this to this, so that they can still maintain that stability? So it's a huge work indeed. It's a huge task. It's more than what we are just discussing, but at least this gives an idea to a layman to understand the main function of the transmission company of Nigeria.
Yeah, it's actually good that you said it's a huge task, because to an average Nigerian, this is a very interesting topic, right?
Yeah.
And what comes to our mind out of all these technical words you've said and you've properly placed the TCN is who is responsible for the blackouts that we encounter when they just say, oh, we see news that something has happened, the grid has
collapsed.
Like what's happening? You've told us that they are responsible for managing the whole flow.
Sure.
So who do we now hold responsible and say, okay, these people are at fault?
Okay. You see, when the power is generated, the availability of the power is not the responsibility of the transmission company of Nigeria. And we have said earlier on that when the power is less than the consumption, there is tendency of failure.
Okay.
So when the system fails because there is inadequate power generated, that's the responsibility and the fault of the generation companies.
Okay.
Alternatively, when the generation capacity is there, but the energy to be consumed has not been delivered to the customers to consume, so you are consuming less than what is generated, there is equally an imbalance, and that is the responsibility of the distribution companies, meaning that they have not connected adequate consumers to be connected to consume the supply, and therefore it causes that destabilization to the entire system. And when you consider the fact that consumers are there requesting this supply, customers are complaining, we don't have light, we don't have supply, it goes on and off. It translates to the fact that, sometimes the failure could be as a result of not connecting the adequate required consumers into the system. And that is the fault of distribution companies. However, there are instances whereby the instability could be managed by the TCN. But when it goes beyond the limits, they could be able to maintain and manage, then the system fails.
Okay.
Now, failure of stabilizing this, when there is possibility of stabilizing it, that's the fault of transmission company of Nigeria.
Okay.
But how do you ascertain that? That is a big concern.
Just like what he said, let me also come in here. We are currently facing this situation in Nigeria. If it's
Sure.
not grid collapse, it's
Yes.
then the issue of maybe not enough power generation according to demand.
Yeah.
So from your point of view as an expert, how can TCN come in here? Do they need to wheel more power? How do they ensure that the generation meets the demand? Because there's got to be a balance. Otherwise, Nigeria can rule for another even 20 years, still
Sure.
facing this same problem. So what's the way out?
Okay. The truth of the matter is that transmission company of Nigeria doesn't generate power. However, the generation companies are generating power to a bit of an extent because the installed capacity of our generators, we currently have about 27 number of power plants in Nigeria connected to the grid. And their total installed capacity is amounting to over 12,500 megawatt. Mm-hmm. But the operational capacity that exists that can be put onto the grid is roughly about 50% of this, roughly around 6,000 megawatt. However, when you look at the record of the consumption, you notice that the highest we have consumed, like in the last quarter of 2023, mm-hmm. the highest we consumed was just roughly about 5,000 megawatt. Meaning there is still deficit of unavailable capacity that is not yet consumed.
So how do we make up for that?
What you see, the distribution companies must agree to take up whatever is generated within the system. Otherwise, the system cannot be stable. And the transmission company doesn't have load to put on there. They only have some what we call compensators and controllers, that when the load is not adequate enough, they can put in. But they have limitation, unlike the loads where you connect several consumers mm-hmm. to consume the supply. And the generators are equally complaining to some extent that, they do have the adequate energy to provide, mm-hmm. but the energy is not off-taken. When we say off-take, it means consuming that energy as it comes in, the utilization. So, alternatively, sometimes they would have to take up this energy to what we call the regional market, the regional electricity market. For example, to Niger, maybe to Benin, to Togo. And that is one of the main reasons why Nigerians are complaining that we don't have adequate power, but we are still supplying other countries. Uh-huh. The generators cannot be able to stabilize the system with what they actually bring in if they bring in the capacity they have. So to enable them now flow in the market, The remaining power, they cannot push it onto the regional market.
I see.
While the Nigerians can utilize the electricity that is accepted by the distribution companies to be supplied to them. So the transmission company of Nigeria actually has no much role per se in ensuring that the supply is utilized adequately, because that is the sole role responsibility of the distribution companies. However, there are some instances whereby the generation may be less than what is required. And in most instances, that comes as a result of the fueling system. Well, you see the gas that is supplied, because about most of the stations we have, about 70% of them are powered by gas. So when the gas supply is actually low, then you find the tendency of having low power supply. In that instance, we could say it is the fault of the generation companies. There are instances whereby it could be the fault of the transmission company, where the power is there, but they could not be able to wheel the power to where it is required. And there are only rare instances. For instance, if there is vandalization.
Grid collapse?
No, not even before you get to the grid collapse. If they cannot wheel what is available there, some of their towers, some of their infrastructure, some of their facilities can be vandalized. Because of this vandalization, they cannot be able to wheel power to some locations.
Okay.
And that is the fault of not TCN per se, but for security challenges. So there are these instances. So what Transmission Company of Nigeria could do is possibly they need to liaise with the regulator, the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, who regulates the responsibilities and functions of all the players in the electricity market, by enforcing the generators to produce the adequate power required, as well as enforcing the distribution companies to take off this power and give to their customers, while the Transmission Company of Nigeria maintains the wheeling of the power. Because currently they have the wheeling capability of roughly about 7,500 megawatt, which is even above the operational capacity of 6,000 megawatt we have said. Okay. However, it's not up to the capacity of the installed generation we have. Okay. So if they have that capacity and the distribution companies can be able to take up this power to the consumers, TCN is actually good to go. Good. This is my belief.
So from what you have said, what I'm getting is this all of these players in the sector, they all have their role to play.
Sure.
And the NERC has to come in to make sure that these players are standing on the same level, releasing and depositing, from what you're saying. Right. So who will Nigerians now hold responsible for the number of national grid has collapsed in the past couple of months? We have been having numbers at this point. Who do we now respond? Because we've been seeing news of
grid collapse.
Yes, and TCN.
Yes.
And from what you're saying, TCN cannot be held responsible.
And just to add to what he's saying, now this is an avenue to educate Nigerians on what the meaning of grid collapse is. So would you just do justice to explaining what grid collapse is, and back to his question, who is to be held accountable for it?
Okay, firstly, when we talk of grid collapse, you could remember earlier I have said one of the responsibilities of the TCN is to stabilize the system and ensure there is balance. When there is imbalance, that is what results into system collapse. The generation is less than the demand, the system will collapse. The demand is higher or lesser than the generation, the system will collapse. The two of them must be equal at every point in time. But TCN doesn't generate power. What they do is they wheel the available power. So if it is the power that is less, that is the fault of the generation companies. But if the power is readily available and wheeled by the TCN, but the customers are not connected, the distribution companies, meaning, are not connecting the adequate required consumers to consume the available power, and that is their responsibility and that is their fault. However, when there is an instance whereby the TCN cannot wheel the available power, then that is when we could now fault the TCN. But customers will not know that TCN did not wheel the power. However, at every point in time when TCN has problem, maybe this tower collapse, there is vandalization of this, there is vandalization of that, or there is inadequate supply, TCN tends to explain by media, from what I used to see, that this is the problem we have, and that is why so areas didn't have supply. So the distribution companies, I think, equally used to do that. But what I seem to understand from some of the reports of the regulator is that the distribution companies at some point are actually rejecting the available load. Even when the load is available, they don't tend to connect to the customers.
Is there a reason?
Well, what they usually say is that the customers are not paying the commensurate of the energy supply to them, meaning the customers are not paying what is given to them. So they feel instead of now giving too much power and the money is not coming in, let's reduce what we give to the customers and try and see how we can manage the cash flow back to the system. That is their claim.
Okay.
And all these are supposed to be regulated by the regulator. How do we balance this? Because there must be equally a balance between the energy supplied and the cash flow into the system. Otherwise, there is going to be liquidity.
Yes,
And
because
when there's liquidity, the market will fail.
I was going to say that, is this the reason why we're suffering so much darkness in many parts of Nigeria, why people are complaining that really this power cannot be, spread across everyone? We're talking about band A, band B. I even hear some Nigerians say there's band Z because they wake up in the night and say, oh, there's power only by 12 to like 3 a.m. So the reason, from what you were saying, is these people are saying they're not paying enough money to be able to balance the power that they are releasing to these people. That's what you're saying.
That's actually one of the complaints. So they are saying the tariff in the Nigerian system
is too
not
high,
cost effective.
or it's too cheap.
It's not cost effective, it's too cheap. So, and this system you are saying just came in of recent, where you have different bands. But the unfortunate thing is that the band A, for example, where you expect more of the cash to come in, are they really getting the supply of that number of hours expected? Because when you are in band A, it is expected that you get supply for not less than 20 hours.
Expected?
Yes.
But that's not the outcome.
Well, I would
it's a talk for another day, really.
It is.
Yeah,
We'll come back to
probably
it.
the house is in band 6. So I really like to say. And lastly, but not the least, some customers are equally complaining that at the detriment of the other customers, band A are given more supply because they expect more from there, and that is at the detriment of other customers, meaning that when you are in band B, that we expect to have a supply of like 15 to 16 hours, you may not have as much as that. Not to talk of when you are in band C. And now you are just educating me that there's even band Z.
No, of course,
Nigerians,
Nigerians and how they come about.
Well, the band thing has been trending.
Yeah, it has
for a
been
while,
trending.
But like he said, this is going to be another topic for another day because of time factor. I think maybe when next we have you on the show, we'll talk about the different bands and everybody, know your zone and what band you're in. So if you see power blackout, you know that, okay, I'm in this band and we're not getting as much.
And
as
actually, the
expected.
regulator made it mandatory on all distribution companies to make it clear and to communicate to their customers for everyone to understand the band they belong to.
Right.
I can see some of them are already putting this information in their website, some social media handles.
So that's good sensitization enough. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Yusuf Khalid. It's been very interactive here with you, and I've learned, just from sitting down and having these conversations with you. And we hope everyone watching would also learn from this. And so Mr. Yusuf Khalil is an expert in power, and we thank you for coming and joining us on today's episode. We look forward to having you next time on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really very much grateful for having you here too.
Our pleasure.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Now, this episode of the Bridge 360 show was anchored by myself, Stephanie Odia, and my co-host,
Merciful Ajinomo. It's always a pleasure.
That's right. So this is the end of today's episode, but this conversation continues on our social media platforms. So please follow us on our social media handles at Bridge 360 Show across all social media platforms. And until I come your way next time, bye for now.